Mykolaiv, and other peaceful Ukrainian cities.
Gulliver Craig, you see that the West also believes that it's a lie, and you've had a week where, as Vladimir Putin's been stepping up the tension where he is, we've had this $1.1 billion fresh pledge of military assistance from the United States. How do Ukrainians feel? On the one hand, they've got the West behind them, more than ever, perhaps. And on the other, of course, what we just again saw out of Red Square.
Zelensky might have got some Ukrainians' hopes up when he made the announcement earlier today that Ukraine had requested a swift entry into NATO, and then Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, was due to hold a press conference. People started dreaming that maybe he was going to make some announcement that would mean that Ukraine's request would be granted. But of course he couldn't possibly do that, and more level-headed people would have known that. And Jens Stoltenberg, of course, said that this is a decision that has to be made by all 30 NATO member countries and cannot be made right now, has to be made unanimously, and so on. So I think that it's possible some Ukrainians are feeling slightly disappointed right now by that, but at the same time there was a clear expression of support for Ukraine from Jens Stoltenberg, and there have been new moves to impose additional sanctions on Russia today by the United Kingdom, the European Union and the United States. I think Ukrainians are feeling reasonably well supported. And I also think that in some strange way, Putin's speech today, making such absurd accusations against the West, the collective West, as he calls it, of totalitarianism, of being like Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief. I mean, I think that there are people in Ukraine who think hopefully this will have at least opened the eyes of those few people in the West who still had some sympathy for Vladimir Putin to the fact that what he is saying has really no grounding in reality, and that can also be applied to these ridiculous allegations that Ukraine is shelling its own cities and civilians that we keep hearing coming from the Kremlin.
Gulliver Craig reporting live from Kyiv. Many thanks for that update. And when Vladimir Putin says no going back, it's coming in a week where it's coming to a head when it comes to the explosions that rocked the currently offline Nord Stream pipelines. Pipelines hit, say, Danish authorities by the equivalent of hundreds of kilos of TNT. All sides point to sabotage, and there, too, Russia's president blames what he calls Anglo-Saxons.
These images were released by the Swedish Coast Guard on Thursday. They show a fourth leak in the Nord Stream pipelines after ruptures first reported on Monday. The unexplained leaks have prompted the European Union and Russia to point at sabotage, with Moscow saying it has intelligence to indicate that the West had a role in the breaches.
There was a clear beneficiary, Washington, of course. If we summarize what has been said by American officials over the past years, putting Nord Stream out of action will allow the United States to increase the supply of its liquefied gas to the European Union.
The EU, meanwhile, has promised the strongest possible response to any intentional disruption of the pipelines, with the US pledging its support. While investigations are still underway, experts say there's no clear winner of the outcome.
Vladimir Putin is, in fact, making two wars. One military against Ukraine that he might lose, but one we started quite a long time ago against the EU, against EU values, and he's using loads of tools to do this, disinformation and weaponization of gas. And we, again, must be prepared for this because he will try to disunite Europe.
The ruptures in the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines were detected in Swedish and Danish waters earlier this week, sending methane spewing into the Baltic Sea and threatening to put them permanently out of use. The joint Russia and Europe multi-billion-dollar project supplied some 40% of the EU's natural gas last year. The latest developments adding to fears of skyrocketing gas prices this winter.
The UN says that the ruptures on Nord Stream could be the biggest ever methane leak ever recorded. That's according to the UN's Environment Program. Meanwhile, EU ministers were meeting this Friday and they've agreed to measures, a windfall tax on energy companies, and plans to cuts for peak hour power consumption during the winter, all this in an effort to try to bring down or at least level those skyrocketing utility bills.
The member states need to identify 10% of peak hours and reduce it by 5%. This will allow to lower consumption of the most expensive energy source, which is currently gas.
For more, let's cross to Brussels and correspondent Dave Keating. Dave, it's a pretty big step. First off, what more do we know on this cutting of peak hour consumption? Is this voluntary or mandatory?
This is mandatory, but there's a couple important things that citizens should keep in mind about this. So it is a mandatory 5% reduction of electricity use during peak hours, but the responsibility for delivering that reduction will not be up to individual households, it will be up to national government. So the member states of the European Union will be able to decide how they want to meet that target. That could be by making consumers use electricity, use less electricity, or they could instead have businesses use less electricity during those hours, or industry. Another important thing to keep in mind is a lot of us, when we think peak hours, we think of the most expensive time that our utility charges us for electricity at home.